The American poet Edwin Arlington Robinson is best known for his poem Richard Cory, and this particular poem was published in The Children of the Night, a poetry collection that came out in 1897. So, Richard Cory then is a poem about a man who ultimately commits suicide. It's a very tragic poem, but it's not just about his life, it's also about the townspeople who keep looking at him, who envy him, and the speaker provides us with an insight into their psychology as well. So let's start with the title here, Richard Cory. And in this particular collection, The Children of the Night, we have various characters, many with rather strange names. So there are characters like Cliff Klingenhagen and Fleming Helfenstein. And Edwin Arlington Robinson was rather aware of naming and what it might signify because his own name is rather unique, right? Edwin Arlington Robinson. So there's an interesting story behind this. He had a couple of older brothers. So he had a brother named Dean and then a brother whose name was Herman, and we'll come back to Herman later. Dean actually died from a drug overdose, so there's a lot of sadness in the family. And Edwin, when he was born, his parents really wanted a girl. So they didn't name him for about half a year. He was born in December 1869. And they didn't name him. But then when they went vacationing in the summer, the other tourists who were there decided, well, he really does need a name. So they had a sort of lottery where they picked names for him. And one of the names that came out of the hat was Edwin. And then the person who had submitted that name as a suggestion was from Arlington, Massachusetts, so the middle name came from there as well. Edwin Arlington Robinson was not really happy about his name for most of his life, but you can see why he's so conscious about naming. And if we think about Richard Cory, later in the poem it refers to a king. Okay, so he's described as king-like, and there is, of course, a very famous king named Richard the Lionheart. Richard the Lionheart, medieval king, known for his role in the Crusades, and he's also related to the story of Robin Hood, right? If you read that particular narrative, so you can see that core here is a little bit like heart, cœur in French. So Richard Cory then has this sort of noble name. In fact, Richard originally means strong ruler, but the name is also rather common. Richard is just a regular name, and Cory doesn't sound quite as noble as the Lionheart. What this suggests then is that this particular name is common, but the townspeople act as if he is king-like. And that presents problems because they don't want to treat him as truly a fellow human being. But you can see as the poem starts that Richard Cory does want to be treated that way. So it says, whenever Richard Cory went downtown, right? It's as if he wants to meet people, talk to them, but that's not really the interaction they're looking for. So as we get to the poem then, let's have a quick look at how the form of the poem takes shape. So in this case, we have a fairly simple rhyme scheme. We have A, B, A, B, and so on. We typically have 10 syllables per line. It's a very orderly poem that way. And they're mostly iambic. Sometimes there's a little bit of variation in the rhythm, but it has kind of a pleasing rhythm as you read on. A very regular rhythm, actually, and you could talk about that in terms of whether it's ironic that the poem is so regular in relation to the unexpected outcome. So as we go on here then, if you look at much of the description in the poem, Richard Cory is described in these almost royal terms, right? So it says he's a gentleman. Some people talk about the fact that he walks on, people walk on the pavement, which sounds kind of British. It's the sidewalk in the US. I don't know how much we should make of that, but certainly there are lots of words that do make him seem quite royal. So we have crown. Now we would probably say from head to toe. Okay, head to toe is the common expression. And here it's been changed to from sole to crown. And we're also reversing directions here from the bottom to the top. He's imperially slim. Okay. He's described as a king later, as we mentioned. He glittered when he walked. as if he is shining. Okay. Even though he's said to be human, it says he fluttered pulses when he said. So people's hearts start racing. There's something so amazing about him. He really looks very royal and very impressive. Okay, so let's dig into the poem a little bit more then and see what particular phrases mean. It says, whenever Richard Cory went downtown, okay, so he's going to the heart of the city, we people on the pavement looked at him. So these become then the common people, right? The common people on the pavement. They are not in a palace or anything like that. Notice too, we have a whole bunch of alliteration here. When, went, we, right? As well as people and pavement. So there's a kind of a pleasing sound to these opening lines. We looked at him. This really suggests a kind of gazing. So it's as if they are looking at him, but notice what they're not doing. They're not talking to him. He talks to them. He says good morning later, but the townspeople don't really respond. And this must be incredibly frustrating to Richard Cory. He's trying to communicate, but there's this gap that opens up because the people look at him, they admire him, and ultimately they envy him, but they don't really allow him to become like them. He was a gentleman from soul to crown. So obviously crown is the top of your head, but also a crown that a king wears. And so there's a pun on that. That suggests that soul may be a pun as well. And we can think of soul, okay? So not just the sole of your feet, the bottom of your feet, but also your soul. And we could also think of something like solitary, being the only one. And he certainly stands out as being solitary. Now, the word soul makes us think then too about religious matters. And as we go on here, the word favored can mean blessed. Okay, so if you think of something like the divine right of kings, kings are said to be blessed by God, ordained, anointed. So there is this sense that he's almost like favored by the gods or by God, and his soul is important as well, right? Although the townspeople don't seem to care that much about it, they're just looking at his appearance. In this context, though, if we look at clean favored, favored doesn't really seem to fit, because clean favored means something like tidy or neat. So he wears good, clean clothes. But favored is a bit weird, isn't it? And we see a bunch of these odd mixtures of things. So imperially slim. Does that mean that people who are thin and slim are automatically more royal, or that royal people tend to be slim? I think you can think of something like Hollywood actors, right, standing out, and people want their good looks. So that's what's going on here, but it's still an odd combination of terms. The same thing with he was always quietly arrayed. So arrayed is a very fancy word for clothed, and again, that suggests a sort of royal context. But quietly arrayed, like did he put on his clothes in silence? Are his clothes silent? It seems a bit odd, doesn't it? But really what it means is that his clothes are not showy. Okay, they're not showy. They're not shouting at you. He's actually dressed in a pretty ordinary fashion. He just wants to be like other people. So when we think about it, it makes sense. And yet this phrase is also odd. It kind of throws us off a little bit. So I think that's important. These weird kind of phrases, we shouldn't try to just explain them and say, well, it all makes sense. There's something awkward about these particular phrases, and maybe that's a bit ominous as well. It's as if the townspeople can't quite grasp who he is and are struggling to find the right phrases. It says he was always human when he talked, so he is just like other people, and he's not trying to be special, but he's obviously not succeeding. This phrase, he fluttered pulses, we mentioned this earlier, and it's a bit of a strange phrase too, because fluttered is not always a verb that's transitive, right? So a transitive verb takes a direct object, something you do to something, but normally I think we would say their pulses fluttered. It's the pulses that would flutter, but it's as if we're giving him agency, right? We're turning him into the one responsible for fluttering other people's pulses. And this is an interesting feature of these kinds of stories. A similar story would be something like Faulkner's short story, A Rose for Emily, where the townspeople are so judgmental that ultimately they seem to drive Emily to do an atrocious deed. So in this case as well, it's as if we want to ascribe agency to Richard Cory as if he's responsible for the responses that people have. Now, all he's saying is good morning, right? It's a pretty ordinary greeting, and yet that is enough to set people's pulses fluttering. We talked about the glittering already. It says he was rich, yes, richer than a king. This may be speculation. We don't know for sure. Often we assume that people who look good and seem to be doing well, that they are extremely rich, but there's often secrets hidden there as well. Then we have the word admirably schooled in every grace. So he has all the social graces. He's very at ease in terms of how he acts. He knows the right etiquette and so on. Originally, the word admirably meant worthy of admiration or even awe-inspiring. So that, again, ties it in with kingship, right? The sense that kings inspire awe. Then we have this little phrase, in fine, and this is related to the French enfin. So enfin means something like finally, in summary. So this means, in summary, to sum up, we thought that he was everything to make us wish that we were in his place. But I think there's more that's going on with this little phrase, in fine. So the word ultimately goes back to Latin, finis, which means end, okay, in the end. And that makes us start thinking about the conclusion of the poem when he puts a bullet in his head. Similarly, the quietly arrayed is a kind of contrast as well to the final sound of the bullet, which is, of course, very loud. So in fine, then, we should maybe start thinking about the end of the poem and the sense of finality that we're going to get. Another way to think about that, about this phrase, is to relate it to the notion of finery. Right? He's dressed in his finest clothes, so perhaps another pun here as well. The poem ends with a strong feeling of resentment. Okay, so there's a lot of resentment at the end. And it's worth quoting a philosopher here just to understand what we mean by resentment. So the philosopher Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche, wrote just a few years before this poem was published. The poem was published in 1897, as we said, and in 1888, just before Nietzsche pretty much went mad, he wrote the following: "And nothing burns you up faster than the emotions of resentment." And then he sums up what these emotions are: anger, sickly vulnerability, powerlessness to take revenge, the lust, the thirst for revenge, every kind of poisonous troublemaking. Resentment born of weakness harms no one more than the weak person himself. It's a very powerful quote, and there's a lot of truth to that, right? If you are sick, for instance, and you become resentful, then that can impede your healing because mentally you're going to be struggling with all of these emotions. When people hurt you, for instance, Nietzsche says it's better to be strong and overcome that than to just kind of constantly be resentful and want revenge and so on. So Nietzsche, even if you don't agree with everything he wrote, had some great insights into the psychology of people. And resentment can especially happen with the lower classes when they are struggling economically and financially, and they want what other people have, but they don't just allow those people to be, they want to bring them down to their own level. So as we look at the end of the poem, it says, "So on we worked and waited for the light and went without the meat and cursed the bread." They're not happy, are they? If you think of this first phrase, waited for the light, that should remind us of the title of the collection, The Children of the Night. And if you read the opening poem of the collection, it points out that there is hope, there is light coming in the morning. But in this case, the townspeople don't seem to have much hope for the light, and they look for it in the wrong places. It's as if they want Richard Cory to be that light, right? And in that sense, they treat him a bit like Jesus. If you think of John 1 verse 5 in the Bible, where it talks about Jesus as the light. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. But it's not right to refer to Richard Cory as the light, and so there's almost a kind of blasphemy here in the poem. Now, in the next line it says, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. So going without the meat means that you have to be economical. Meat is more expensive. Although you could argue that there's something intentional about this as well. You could go without the meat in order to save, to kind of be a miser and save up your money in order to become like Richard Cory. That's a possibility. But the main point here really is that these people are struggling financially and they don't have much to enjoy. Their response, though, is to curse the bread, which is not a very appropriate response. If you think, for instance, of the Lord's Prayer in the Bible, give us this day our daily bread, right? It's not something you curse, it's something you give thanks for. At least you have the necessities of life. But that is obviously not good enough in this instance. Notice here again we have some beautiful alliteration. So we worked and waited for the light and went without the meat and cursed the bread. So lots of W's here, which really pushes the poem forward towards the end. Another thing that helps to drive the poem forward is something we kind of skipped over before. There's a lot of ands in the poem, right? So, and he was always, and he was always, and he was rich and admirably schooled. There's a kind of constant listing of things, which at first can be just descriptions of Richard Cory, but there is a relentlessness to this. And in fact, these first two occurrences, we have a longer phrase here. We call this anaphora, where we start a sentence with the same construction, or multiple sentences like that. So the result then is to kind of drive the poem forward as if these descriptions at first are just, accurate statements, but then later they become charges, right? It's like they're saying, he has this and this and this, and can you believe it? And it becomes almost accusatory. The final two lines then have our dramatic conclusion. Some people might call this sensational and a bit overdone, but I think it is very dramatic. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. So the calmness here, again, contrasts with the loud sound of the bullet. And we can assume that Richard Cory probably felt lonely and miserable. We don't know what else was going on. Were there actually financial troubles? We don't know. But it's important not to speculate too much. And that's because if we do, we become like the townspeople. We start to gossip and we become more interested in the drama of this than in the human quality of who he actually was. So it's important to focus on sympathy and not just melodrama. There's been a lot of speculation about whether Richard Cory was a particular person. Various people have been put forward, most notably Edwin Arlington Robinson's own brother Herman. So we mentioned Herman before, as you might recall. And Herman married a woman named Emma Shepherd. And as it turns out, Edwin Arlington Robinson himself loved Emma. He kept courting her, and he was deeply unhappy that she ended up marrying Herman. But Herman himself had some bad business ventures, struggled with alcoholism, became estranged from his wife, and finally ended up dying in 1909. So his wife later felt that Richard Cory was a reference to Herman. And that's certainly possible, but I think we can also say more broadly that this is a common thing, right? That people seem to have it all together, and yet when we look more closely, there's much grief and much sadness in the background. I want to end here with one final quotation, and this is from another poem that Edwin Arlington Robinson wrote. It's also included in our collection, and this is the poem Zola. So it refers to Émile Zola, who was a French writer, one of the naturalists, and one of the defining features of his work is that he really describes the terrible working conditions of lower-class people in order to also create change, make people aware of the horrible conditions of the factories, and so on. So that particular poem starts with these two lines. Because he, that's the artist, puts the compromising chart of hell before your eyes, you are afraid. It's a fascinating line, isn't it? As the audience, are you afraid when you see the grim reality of life? The reality that's embarrassing, that's incriminating, right? Compromising. How do you respond to that reality? And that's what Richard Cory is about as well. Do you respond with envy, with Nietzsche's resentment? Or do you respond with true sympathy and empathy in order to understand the other person? Richard Cory, then, to conclude, is a profound poem, beautifully written, and I think it's going to be enjoyed and treasured for a long time to come.